Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are waiting for a few more folks to join. We're seeing people pop on here. So if you give us a minute or two, we'll get started probably 3 minutes, 4 minutes past the hour, and talk a little bit about how to effectively use role-based access control in the real world. Give it one more minute here, and I appreciate you bearing with us. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us today. The webinar we're going to talk about is how to effectively use role-based access control in the real world. We're excited for the opportunity to talk to you about the ins and outs of role-based access control, share some of our experiences and lessons learned. Jerry? Before we get started, I thought it'd be good to do some introductions, put some names and faces together. So my name is Hanno Ekdahl. I am the founder of Idenhaus. We specialize in cybersecurity and identity management. I've been doing identity management for almost 20 years now, and Idenhaus is about 5 years old. Jerry?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jerry Combs. I'm the principal identity architect for Idenhaus, and I've been doing identity management, access management for about 25 years now.
And my name is Ron Bowren. I've been with Idenhaus now for almost 3 years, but have been in the industry as well, well over, I hate to admit, 20 plus years, and have worked primarily in both the healthcare space and now in the manufacturing space.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Jerry. So here's the agenda for our webinar today. We're going to start off with an overview of role-based access control and how it can add value to organizations that are trying to manage access better. There's a strong value proposition for role-based access control, and there's a lot of misconceptions too. So we want to separate the hype from the reality in RBAC projects, manage expectations. And the next piece of that is also managing expectations within the organization. Sometimes folks look at the technology as a silver bullet that can solve more than it can. So we want to make sure that we communicate honestly and accurately about what the technology can do. And then we talk a little bit about the end, about the role-based access control implementation strategy that's best for your organization. And then we'll open it up for some questions and answers at the very end. So as an introduction to role-based access control, which is really how we manage access for users in a more efficient way, it's predicated on security, right? And security itself is not possible without transparency. I have to be able to know who you are. Are you an employee, a contingent worker, an external user? What you are allowed to have access to, which is going to vary by user type, right? Employees don't have the same access as a contractor or an external user. We also have some applications and data that are more sensitive that deserve additional protections and security. And then ultimately, we need to be able to audit and report on that access so it can be properly managed, right? We need to identify exceptions. Does someone have more access than they should? And we also need to be able to meet compliance requirements, right? In order to do that, I have to establish who you are and know what you have access to, right? I need that transparency. But what we find is that complexity is the enemy of transparency, and anyone who's in any large organization knows that there's organizational complexity. We have reorganizations, we have titles and job responsibilities that may not be consistent across departments and divisions. There's also merger and acquisition activity where we're trying to take a different organizational structure and merge it into ours or spin someone off, which can create a huge amount of complexity. And then our IT systems are complex as well. So we talked about mergers and acquisitions. We also acquire technology through mergers and acquisitions. We have redundant systems. We also have shadow IT. Users are administered locally in individual systems, and things don't match up from system to system and administrator to administrator. So what we're really looking for is how do we take that complexity and get to the transparency that we require that drives the simplicity we need to actually manage complexity. And so the takeaway from this slide is that organization makes a system of many appear fewer. So we want to hide the complexity from the user and better manage our systems. And we can do that once we define standards for data, processes, and policies. So role-based access control offers us a better way. It's a framework that we can use to manage access more efficiently. And so we can assign users the appropriate level of access based on their business role. So if I'm an accountant one at an organization, there's a certain set of applications that I should have access to, right? So if I know that you're an accountant one, I know what your job responsibilities are in that role, I can assign you the appropriate access. I don't give you too much. And so we are giving users an accurate set of rights to do their job function, and that's all that we're giving them. It also allows us to do that in a more timely manner because the system can automatically assign the role to the user based on who they are, right? Their role, their level in the organization, their location. There can be a number of ways that we construct that role, right? So one role for accountant one may not be appropriate across Asia, North America, and Latin America, but we may have an accountant one role in North America, an accountant one role in Latin America, and we can define what those roles are and automatically assign the user to the role to give them the right access. And this model is also future-focused. It allows the organization to grow and scale through the addition of roles and supporting processes that help both with access provisioning and with attestation and compliance. So from a business perspective, why do organizations implement role-based access control solutions? How does it help them out? Well, there's productivity gains, right? So workers get almost all the access they need on day one and can get started in their job. So a lot of organizations struggle to get users more than basic network access with file and print and maybe a couple file shares and some Office 365 apps. They can't get them into their financial applications, or they can't get them into some of the other apps that they need to do their job. We can automate that through role-based access control. Role-based access control also improves our security because it supports two of the main security pillars, which are least privilege, don't give a user more access than they need, and segregation of duties. So I assign access to the user that does not allow them to hold conflicting roles. For example, I can't request something and also be the person who approves that, whether it's an expense report or a PO or something else. And then last, improved performance, right? There's less friction in the system for business users. There's less friction for IT that has to spend less effort provisioning users. And our audit and compliance folks, it makes their life a lot easier too, because it's much easier to say who has access to what, because they were assigned to the role based on their job function. Ergo, they should have access to those applications. And now I'll hand it over to Jerry to take you through the rest.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start by talking about our approach to designing systems and solving problems. And it all begins with solution design rule number 1. And that's that every system, issue, and process has a level of complexity in it that you can't reduce any further. So getting people in and out of systems, managing their access, reviewing access, all of the things that go into identity and access management and all your governance processes. There's a level of complexity to all of that that has to be done. Somewhere the work has to be performed. So once you get all of the clutter out of the way, from that point forward, developing a solution is all about deciding how to distribute that complexity. So while you may make things easier on the end user, you may make things more complicated on your IT staff. You may make things easier for one system integration, but more difficult for another. So roles, like every other solution, require you to make decisions about where you're going to put that complexity. So it's not just simply that you can reduce the effort and complexity everywhere, but you have to make good decisions about where you move it around and where you use it. And we'll take that rule into account throughout this presentation. All right. So what is role-based access control? At its most simple level, it's a way of organizing access as an alternative to directly assigning access to users. So on the left here, you can see that we have access assigned directly to users. And as the number of access and entitlements goes up, the number of users goes up, it goes up exponentially. So the complexity becomes overwhelming. And the only way to review it is to look at every entitlement for every user. And there's no governance beyond that level of the user. What role-based access control does is it puts a level of abstraction between the user and the entitlements in the end systems, so that we have two types of governance that can be done. We can do governance of assigning the users to the roles, so what roles are appropriate to that user, and then we can separate that from what governance is appropriate for what entitlements belong to that role. And so this makes the entire system easier to govern, easier to manage, easier to provision, okay? And can reduce complexity if it's done well. But that also brings up a question, what is not role-based access control? And what I mean by that is, from an academic point of view, role-based access control is defined in a NIST standard, and there's an entire array of academic work around role-based access control. It was actually invented in the 60s, and it's been used in many, many different systems. But within that strictly academic sense, it's meant for application within a single security domain. And roles are used directly by the application to make access decisions. So something like SAP that actually uses roles internally uses role-based access control. But that's not really what we're talking about in terms of an enterprise-wide multi-system access management system that uses roles, because the vast majority of your applications and systems don't use roles directly. They may use groups, they may use users, they may do database entries, ACLs, but very few of them actually make use of roles. And even when they do, the roles that you manage within the IDM system are often not the same roles that you manage within the application. So when we're doing management across multiple systems, a more correct term is role-based access management. And in this system, which is what we're going to talk about today, the role-managed access is translated into the non-role-based model in the end system. So for example, your Active Directory, it may be translated into group memberships or ACL assignments. So we're going to be discussing roles in the context of managing access across multiple systems as part of an IGA program. So this is very different than the formal academic meaning of RBAC. And you do have to treat it differently. And some of those concepts and methodologies that apply for formal RBAC don't apply within the context of IGA. So within an IGA role implementation.
Jerry?
Yes.
Hey, sorry. So I just want to chime in quickly on that last slide and just make a point. So a good example of role-based access control within an application would be the GRC module, for example, in SAP, that allows you to assign users to different roles based on the level of access they should have, right? So some platforms are more mature. They have that concept of role-based access control baked in, where others don't, like Jerry said, where there's a group membership or other way to provide access to the application.
Right. So in this context, your roles are typically managed within your IDM or identity governance platform, and users are associated with that role. And then your platform translates those high-level roles into access within each of the systems. So like I said up at the top, you've got a group within Active Directory. You may have a direct ACL assignment within a database inside an application. Or it could be an application role, like with SAP. And so it's not only managing the roles, but it's also how they get translated into entitlements within the end system. And the roles are used to aggregate security and access across multiple systems. Okay? And the most common transformation is to group memberships. And we'll talk, we may explore the impact of groups on this at some other time, but that's probably a topic for an entire presentation in itself.
Fair enough.
Okay. So we're going to talk about 6 common role implementation pitfalls. So these are things we have seen again and again during implementations and when people try to understand RBAC within an IGA system. And those are RBAC absolutism, trying to force all access management into a role-based model. Trying to do everything in a single model is nearly impossible. Number 2, believing vendors' hype about auto magic role mining. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but there is no magic and no product is perfect. The third pitfall is implementing an inappropriate role model. So if there's no magic, then you have to come up with that role model on your own, and there are definitely pitfalls in doing that. The fourth pitfall is thinking that role engineering is a one-time task. It's not. The fifth pitfall is implementing roles, but doing 100% permission-based access reviews anyway. Why do roles if they're not going to make your life easier? And then the last pitfall, and probably the most important, is implementing roles without first having a solid IDM, IGA foundation, not having your house in order and your processes and policies in order. So let's dig into these a little deeper. The first is RBAC absolutism. So this is how to spend huge amounts of money for minimal and effort for minimal results. So RBAC is a useful tool, but it's not the solution to all IGA issues. So you really need to follow the 80-20 rule. Take that low-hanging fruit that is obviously appropriate for roles and easily managed and easily structured, and implement that first. And consider alternative methodologies to meet the objectives for that last 20%. So look at attribute-based access control, look at direct user permission assignments, but with a strong automation and governance support. So how much you can actually do within a role structure depends on a lot of factors from your organization and structure and culture. So forcing the use of roles where it's not appropriate can actually make things worse.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jerry. So one of the challenges that we see is you get role proliferation or role explosion, where you're trying to use a role to manage every level of access in the organization, and then the roles themselves become unmanageable. So the idea is manage the things that should be managed through roles. So that could be an application that needs to be very secure, and so you want to make sure that only the people who have access to it should have access to it. Applications or parts of the organization where you have high turnover, so you're provisioning a lot of users into and out of an application. And the third one is just high volume of users generally. So anything where there's a lot of manual administration and you can alleviate that by using role-based access control. those three different buckets tend to be your best categories for role-based access control solutions.
And Jerry, a lot of times we get the question of, well, then how many roles should I have, right, based on my organization size? And as you stated, it really depends upon the governance model you're trying to enforce from an attestation perspective. But we actually had a field experience with a customer who had 60,000 employees and over 180,000 roles at the business level. And it made it very difficult for them to even fathom doing attestation on 180,000 roles. And it was because they turned every direct assignment or every little exception into a role. And they discovered the hard and long way that it's best not to do that, as you've stated here.
I think that's a great example.
All right. The second pitfall is that vendors will try to tell you that their product has the capability to analyze your data and spit out a role model. But the truth is, there is no product on the market that can generate a truly useful, ready-to-use role model. There is no magic algorithm. The very best ones can provide some useful insight into the current access assignments that people have and suggest ways to group those into roles. Most of these automatic role mining tools are a complete waste of time. And also remember that data quality can have a severe impact to both automated and manual analysis. So getting that data quality under control, having that part of a solid IDM foundation is critical. So the takeaway is designing and implementing a role model that works for your organization will require manual analysis. Plan for that up front in your program. And also, we strongly recommend that you engage someone who's experienced in building those role models and knows how to think about the trade-offs and that's made the mistakes before. So there is no automatic role mining and no free lunch.
Yeah, and Jerry, you hear a lot about you hear a lot about the artificial intelligence models and all that. Just understand it's actually been proven even in the cybersecurity space that AI models are only as good as their training data. So if the data they use to train their algorithms doesn't match your organizational data, you're going to get really, your results could really be out of whack with what you're trying to achieve.
Right. The other issue is that no matter how good they are, if they're looking at your current access and how people are assigned access, the odds are very likely that the way you're currently doing it is not really the way you want to do it going forward. So just looking at current state isn't enough for developing an effective go-forward model. Okay.
Well, and I agree with that. So building off what you guys were saying, if you think about it, if as just a couple of examples, right? If someone's been at your organization for a long period of time, they've generally acquired much more access than they really need to do their jobs, right? I moved from position to position and people kept adding new system access for my new role, but they never took away the access I need for my old role. So if you put a role mining tool in that environment, it's going to detect patterns or select candidate roles that really aren't appropriate because the access for the users hasn't been cleaned up first, which is really what Jerry's talking about here.
Yep.
The other thing that can also happen is that you can wind up lumping users together in business roles that actually perform different functions because their access is very similar, but they really should have separate job functions.
Yep. Which brings us to the next pitfall, which is implementing an inappropriate role model. And this one is such a big thing that it gets at 2 slides. Implementing an inappropriate role model will cost you money and frustrate your efforts at implementation. Every organization is unique. There's no single best practice, and every role model is a compromise. In some cases, it's not going to meet all your capabilities. So you have to figure out the proper place to put that complexity when you're building your role model. So the role model may not be well suited to your management platform. So not all of the automation and IGA platforms support the same role capabilities. So it's important to look at that as you build your role model. So the right model is based on your specific organization and the systems that you're managing. And lastly, if the role model doesn't allow the majority of your access to be managed by role, then change your model or stop using roles and move to another methodology. And I can't stress that highly enough, that if there are lots of situations that are inappropriate for roles, or inappropriate for roles at a massive scale. So the roles are just one component of IGA, and you may need to consider other methodologies within that mix. Okay, so well, change slides here, maybe. All right, so when you're implementing your role model, there are a number of things you need to consider. So the first is, what are the objectives of your implementation program? What are you trying to solve? What are you trying to accomplish? And you need to prioritize those objectives, because that's how you make decisions about those trade-offs. The next is organizational structure. How structured is your organization? How unstructured? How matrixed is it? How complex is it? And that follows on to looking at flexibility requirements. Some organizations are very standardized and slow to change, and jobs are well defined and well structured. Others require massive flexibility as people move from project to project. And so all of that needs to go into your role model. Then you need to look at the current state of access rights, what users currently have. And it's not so important there as that drives your roles, but that drives your thoughts about how you get from where you are to where you want to be. Then you also need to look at your governance and identity management maturity. Implementing an overly complex role model that you're not prepared to support and you don't have the processes in place to deal with isn't going to do you much good. You need to look at your data quality and data availability. What do you know, and how good is that data? What do you know about what access people have, and how do you make sure you don't break things as you implement your role model? And lastly, look at your IGA platform capabilities. So you need to understand intimately what your system is capable of and what it's not capable of, how it calculates roles, what its scalability issues are, how it handles inheritance. There's all kinds of things that need to be taken into account as part of your IGA platform. And you need to understand that in the real world, not in the marketing that the vendor sold to you, because the vendors are going to tell you all kinds of things. But actually taking that system and building it out to the scale of your organization may show some cracks and issues in that platform. The next pitfall is thinking that role engineering is a one-time task. So change is constant, both in your organizational structure and in your systems. So creating, modifying, and removing roles is an ongoing effort. You may establish a general role model and a set of policies, but you're always going to be doing continuous role model updates and creating and governing your roles. So it's going to have, your model is going to have to be reviewed and updated as your organization and systems change, and you must plan for this ongoing effort of that and staff appropriately. And also expect to periodically engage outside expertise, because it's very likely you're going to develop that level, a high level of experience in role management and role design in-house. So plan for the ongoing effort and realize this is something that goes on an ongoing basis. Okay. The fifth pitfall is implementing roles but doing 100% permission-based access reviews anyway. So if you're not going to take advantage of the benefits, then roles are really not worth the effort. In order to make this clear, you should separate the governance of role membership from the governance of role content. They're two different governance processes, and don't try to do them all at once. And then focus your effort on minimizing the exceptions. So update your roles. Constantly look at, can we use a role? Can we add access to a role? Can we do a different role? Instead of doing direct to user assignments. And then when the direct to user assignments you do have, review them separately. Review the exceptions, not every assignment. So once again, if your role model doesn't allow the majority of your access to be managed by role, then change your model or look at a different methodology. And the last pitfall is implementing roles without first having a solid IDM IGA foundation. So if you don't have the processes, policies, and systems in place, role implementation isn't going to help much. Poor data quality, which is a result of immature IGA systems and processes, will also doom your efforts. Also, out of control administration, or allowing access to be managed through alternate processes. So you can have the best RBAC in the world, but if you have people going into AD and changing group memberships and entitlements outside of your RBAC system, then you're going to have chaos. Even when you have a nice mature platform that can handle those kind of changes and deal with them and report on them, if you don't have those processes and policies in place, you're going to have a lot of extra effort and a lot of bad data. So we talked about the pitfalls. So now we're going to talk about some of the things you need to do as part of your implementation. And the first is managing expectations in your organization. And this starts with don't oversell the benefits. So RBAC is fantastic. You can make things easier on the end users. You can make things easier on the reviewers. But generally, when you're doing this, it's because you need to improve security. You need to improve governance. And if you're implementing this system, you may actually make things put more work on people as reviews are implemented, as new processes are implemented. Also, you have to do that ongoing role engineering and support of the system. So manpower reductions are really unlikely. You're probably not going to be able to change staffing significantly because you're not doing manual direct user administration anymore. If you're looking at this as a manpower savings, that's unlikely. Now, automation can help there, but there's new tasks and new processes that have to be done by somebody. So the manpower benefits are usually a wash. Be sure to communicate that a transition effort will be required. Getting from where you are to a well-governed role model is not simple. It will require some pain and some changes within the organization. So be sure to communicate up front that transition effort is going to be expected, and set the expectation that business process changes will be needed. Okay.
Hey, Jerry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think Jerry's done a nice job outlining these points. So one of the things that we typically recommend as part of our role-based access control engagements is a governance structure. And oftentimes what we see is that there may be an HR governance structure where they're talking about their data sets and what they need for their own regulatory compliance, whether it's benchmarking compensation or affirmative action, EEOC compliance requirements. There's also finance tends to have a big stake in the game here as well, right? So they've got their own obligations in terms of reporting results to the street, how they organize data, how they track things like compensation, how that ties into their financial models. So tapping into those existing governance structures and integrating them where you have an IT or IT security governance board that also is cross-pollinated with your HR governance, your finance governance, your ERP governance, especially in a manufacturing environment. All those need to come together to define standards, to understand the data quality. And oftentimes what you'll find is that the data quality issues that may impact role-based access control are also impacting finance, for example, that's trying to do their own benchmarking and reporting, and they don't have all the data that they need either. And so once you aggregate all that demand and start having open, transparent conversations, you're really able to define the data set, come up with a plan to improve data quality so that everyone can be successful together.
Okay, thank you, Hunter. So that brings us to recommendations. So the first recommendation is RBAC can be a valuable component of an IGA program, but it's not the only way to get to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Be open to other options. Look at rule-based access control, attribute-based access control, policy-driven access control. There's a lot of methodologies, including request-based and strong automation. There's lots of tools within the IGA world to deal with these things. And going 100% RBAC isn't the only way to do it. So define and prioritize your objectives before selecting a platform or developing an implementation strategy. So if you've already got a platform, you're kind of stuck. You have to work with what you have. But you need to define and prioritize your objectives and get some idea of what role structure you're interested in doing, what might work well for your organization. And that needs to go into your input and select it as an input to selecting your platform and developing your implementation strategy.
And I agree with that, Jerry. So one of the things here to think about is when you talk about implementation strategy, if you understand your objectives and your priorities, you can start to sequence out the integrations that you're going to need in order to implement role-based access control and balance the complexity of the work against the value delivered to the business. So you hopefully can identify some quick wins to demonstrate progress and value, to also generate stakeholder buy-in and keep the momentum of the project moving forward.
Yep. So you need to be pragmatic in your use of roles. Use them where they make sense. Try to get as much value out of them as you can, but realize you're not going to be able to solve every problem with roles. And then you need to implement roles incrementally. You're not going to be able to do it as a big bang across your entire population and all of your applications at once. Unless your environment's very simple, that's just not going to happen. So you need to plan that incremental implementation into your program. You need to plan for data cleansing and role engineering effort. So you need to realize during your implementation that's going to have to be done, and that especially as you move toward access reviews, you're going to have to do the first few access reviews possibly to even get your house in order, to clean things up and to know what people have and what they should have. So there's going to be a significant effort during implementation for data cleansing, data analysis, and role engineering. And then there's going to be some ongoing need for that as well. And I know this sounds self-serving and I don't want it to be marketing speak, but don't go it alone. Engage experienced resources. There's so much you can learn after you've done a few implementations and done them within different contexts that make things easier in the long run. So make sure you engage experienced resources. All right, Ron, Hano, anything to add? Okay.
Ron?
Yeah, go ahead and move on. I was going to say part of our challenges with all of this is, role-based access management, as Jerry pointed out, is an endeavor that once you start down the path of realizing how you're currently managing access, a lot of times they'll put this burden strictly on IT to say, go do this. And it really cannot be just an IT project when it comes to role engineering and role management. As Hano pointed out, pulling in a proper governance model first and getting the right stakeholders at the table to help them understand what the difference is between having an employee show up one day and having that employee spend the next 2 weeks trying to figure out what to ask, walk over to somebody's cube. Hey, how did you get access to that? And how do you get access to this? Submitting all the tickets to request that access. That should all ultimately, your goal should be to say, why can't I, as we have one customer doing, why can't I, within 24 hours of hiring a person, have 90% of their access already granted to them? Why can't I? And that's kind of the goal of a lot of these role-based access control methodologies. Is it may not help the IT department in terms, as Jerry pointed out, complexity, but it can definitely help the overall organization in terms of employee productivity, because an employee doesn't have to wait 2 weeks to settle in. Within 24 hours or 2 days or 3 business days, they're ready to rock and roll with all the services and applications they need to do their job.
Right. It also makes things easier for deprovisioning and for changing access when people move within the organization. So it's very, very difficult to handle moves well within an organization if you're not using roles. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions. And I've got one question here already. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I've got a first question here, and that and we actually get this one all the time, is what's the difference between roles and groups, and can't I do a lot of this with groups? The answer is the distinction between roles and groups is another one of those things that there's a huge amount of academic debate around. And the difference really is in the context of how they're used. So groups are primarily collections of users. Roles are primarily collections of entitlements. Now, of course, you can vary that perspective and use them in different ways. But generally, roles have the concept of managing the entitlements within the role. They have a different inheritance model than groups do, where groups have an inheritance model at all. And it's just really a collection of contexts. And there's not, you could achieve some of the same things using groups within like a single directory, but there's really no good models and processes for using groups on platforms that support multiple systems and multiple solutions. So it's really just the context that they're used in, the type of metadata that's added to them. So roles typically also have owners, they have approvers, they have processes tied to them, they have other metadata tied to them, descriptions. Obviously, you can do all that with groups too. It's just not something that's normally done within the context of an IGA system.
I would also add, the ability to enforce segregation of duties and least privileges model access is much easier using a roles-based approach than a groups-based approach.
Yeah, and groups don't typically have a structured governance approach to them in the same way that roles do. So typically, and they're also typically static, where roles can be dynamic based on context. So you may be an employee in one context or a customer in a different context, and those roles can change dynamically. Groups typically don't do that.
Yeah, the other thing that we're finding with group management is that, but with groups, the other at the technical level, the visibility, as you talked about earlier on, of knowing what that group actually grants everybody to do is very difficult to acquire. Whereas with roles, because it's an entitlement grouping, you get to see right away what it's granting in terms of permissions.
Thanks, Ron. So feel free to chime in with questions. I got a few more here that have already been queued up. First question, when using attribute-based access control, how can you convince HR of the required attributes to truly identify the basic access to required apps? So to me, I'm gonna take a stab at it, Jerry, and let you follow.
Go for it.
Right. So,
I think we're going to say the same things.
Well, I think that gets back to the governance comment that I made earlier, right? So working with HR, working with finance, working with your ERP system, the conversations that I've had at a major client I'm working at right now, it was interesting to get us all in the room and start having those conversations about the data and what our requirements were. And what we found was that the same requirements that we had for role-based access control were shared by the ERP platform owner and by the finance department. And all three of us needed the same data from HR to be successful and move the mission of the company forward. So I think it's having those open, honest conversations and establishing governance and talking about the data. You'll find out that what impacts RBAC oftentimes impacts other functional areas too.
Right. And there really isn't, if you look at what do I need to do attribute-based access control, the information you need is really not any different from what you need to do effective role-based access control. You can't place people in roles based on policy or rules if you don't have the data about them. So if you're not getting that data from HR, it's going to impact you whether you're doing RBAC or attribute-based.
Thanks, Jerry. Next question, how to handle users who frequently move from one location to the other. For example, an accountant moving from Latin America to North America, and they have a condition that they should not have access to Latin American role when they're in North America. So for me, again, if I may, sorry, it's tough to read these. I want to answer them too. So give me a stab.
You're doing great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we talked about that a little bit earlier with the attributes that define access, right? So I talked about the accountant one role, right? So you move from Latin America to North America. Well, when you make that move, HR should be updating your data. So I can apply policies around those roles. Those roles define what permissions you have. So if you're no longer in Latin America, now you're in North America, I've changed your role, which Jerry also talked about at the end, which is you move, your role gets updated. Now you're in Accountant One North America role. You no longer have the Accountant One Latin America role. And so your access is adjusted as your data attributes are updated.
Right. And in a more mature platform, you could actually change that dynamically based on where the location someone logs in from. So even without any updates within the HR data, but that requires a pretty high level of maturity. And with that, we've come to the end of our allocated time.
I've got two more questions. If you can let me, I think that we can answer them pretty quick.
Well, let's do it.
All right. So follow-up question was, do we recommend having parent-child role concepts, so hierarchical roles, right, where the parent has a common set of entitlements and the child has some exclusive entitlements that only a few members in the role can choose?
So that model usually makes sense. So there are almost always hierarchies within the organization that are useful in that. So you could have an employee role, a contractor role, and then you could have roles for specific job functions or specific locations. So there definitely is almost always a use in creating a role hierarchy. Not always, but I would say the majority of the time it's a very helpful concept.
Yeah, and in some architectures, I know AWS is starting to show this with their role access, and I know there's some vendors out there that are introducing location dynamics, meaning instead of naming the role, John Doe in South Africa, or Accountant One in South Africa, they create an Accountant One role, but then they have a location that it's associated to, and you can associate policy to that location.
Okay. All right, Hunter.
All right, final question. So a follow-up question someone had was, so roles could get groups of groups to grant access?
Yes, they can. But generally, when you do groups of groups, hierarchical groups actually can create more confusion and complexity. So generally, this is a longer discussion we can probably have another time, so please contact me about it. But I actually find that groups of groups is generally a bad concept, and that it usually causes more issues than it solves. So if you've got an effective role model and a good IGA platform, there are better ways to do that, managing it outside of the directory, outside the application.
And that concludes our question and answer session. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate it and look forward to our next conversation. We'll have another webinar coming out in July, and we'll be reaching out with the information about that as well.
And please contact us if you have any questions or want any further discussion or clarification. We'll be happy to talk to you.
Thanks, everybody.